Picture this. I caught our power-hungry HOA president red-handed, having my boat towed at 5 a.m., but her smug smile vanished when she realized I had proof the land was mine, and her whole property line scam was about to unravel. What would you do if you discovered your HOA president was secretly redrawing property lines to steal your land? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. The bright orange paper fluttering on my boat stopped me dead in my tracks. I had just gotten home from a long day at work, looking forward to planning this weekend's fishing trip with my daughter, when I saw it. My hands shook as I ripped the notice off my beloved 24-foot fishing boat that had been in our family for 3 generations. The paper was warm from sitting in the sun all day, and the words made my blood boil. Violation notice. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. At the bottom was a signature I'd come to dread. Karen Sarah, HOA President. I looked at my boat, sitting proudly in the exact same spot it had been for the past 5 years, well within the boundaries of my property. My grandfather's compass still hung from the steering wheel, catching the evening light. We'd never had any issues until Karen moved in 6 months ago and somehow got herself elected HOA president. Just then, I heard the distinct click-clack of expensive heels on pavement. Karen was doing her daily inspection walk, clipboard in hand, her perfect blonde bob swaying as she marked down every blade of grass that dared grow a millimeter too high. She spotted me, holding the notice, and walked straight toward my driveway. "Oh good, you found my notice," she said with a tight smile. "That boat simply has to go. It's lowering property values. The HOA bylaws clearly state no recreational vehicles can be stored in plain sight." She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. I took a deep breath, remembering the property survey I'd done when I first moved in. "Karen, this boat is parked on my private property. The land extends 15 feet beyond where you think it ends. I have the documentation to prove it." Her smile flickered. "Well, I have updated plans that show otherwise. The HOA recently had all property lines reassessed. This area," she said, vaguely gesturing toward my boat, "is actually common ground now. Something felt off. I'd never received notice about any reassessment, and I served on the architectural committee until Karen dissolved it last month." As if reading my mind, my neighbor Emma called out from her porch across the street. "That's funny, Karen. I worked at the county clerk's office for 30 years. I don't remember seeing any recent surveys filed for our neighborhood." Karen's face turned pink. "The paperwork is being processed. Regardless, that boat needs to be moved by Friday or I'll have it towed." She turned sharply and click-clacked away, but not before I saw her throw a worried glance at Emma. Later that evening, while digging through my filing cabinet for my property documents, I got a text from David next door. "Hey, check your security cameras from last Tuesday. Karen was measuring your property line at 2 a.m. with some guy I've never seen before." I pulled up the footage. Sure enough, there was Karen in the dark, whispering and pointing while a man in a suit took measurements. But what really caught my attention happened after they thought they were out of camera range. Karen handed the man an envelope that looked suspiciously thick. Just then, my daughter walked into my office. "Dad, are we still going fishing this weekend?" The concern in her voice lit a fire in me. I picked up my phone to call Emma. If Karen wanted to mess with property lines, she was about to learn she picked the wrong family. But as I dialed, I noticed something odd in the footage that made me pause. Karen and the mystery man weren't just measuring my property. They were measuring everyone's. What exactly was our new HOA president up to? The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center. I arrived early with a folder full of evidence. I wasn't about to let Karen Sarah bully me into moving my boat without a fight. As neighbors filed in, I saw Karen huddled with her loyal followers in the corner, shooting smug looks my way. I had spent my entire lunch break at the county records office digging through property files. Mrs. Emily, the kind clerk there, even stayed late to help me track down the original neighborhood plans from when the homes were first built. She seemed genuinely concerned when I told her about Karen's new property line claims. When it was my turn to speak, I walked calmly to the front. Karen sat in her designer blazer, tapping her expensive pen against her notepad like she was already planning her next violation. I opened my folder and spread the official maps across the table. "According to these county records," I said, pointing to the clearly marked boundaries, "my boat is parked entirely within my property line." The room fell silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Karen jumped to her feet, her face red. "These new plans clearly show that area is common ground," she snapped, pulling out a set of documents that looked freshly printed. But the measurements didn't match what I had found in the official records. I asked to see her documents more closely. She clutched them to her chest. "These are official HOA documents," she said, her voice climbing. "They're confidential." That's when David, usually quiet at these meetings, spoke up. "I think Karen's right," he said, avoiding my gaze. "The boundaries were redrawn last year." But he was sweating and his hands were shaking. Something was definitely off. I pulled out my phone and showed everyone the photos I had taken of the original property stakes. Metal markers still in the ground since the homes were built. They matched my maps, not Karen's. Other neighbors began murmuring and flipping through their copies of Karen's plans. Emma, once a property lawyer before retiring, raised her hand. "These measurements don't add up," she said, adjusting her glasses. "According to these numbers, half the properties would be overlapping." Karen's face turned from red to white. She began gathering her documents, dropping several in her rush. Something about the ones that fell caught my attention. The dates were different, but the ink looked the same, as if they had all been printed at once. Just then, Mrs. Emily from the county office walked in. She'd come to the meeting to confirm what I'd found. "This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold. This story is far from over, and things are just beginning to unfold." Karen Sarah left the meeting in a storm, but not before turning on her heel and snarling, "We'll see who has the right documents," as a final threat to have my boat towed anyway. I noticed David trailing behind her, looking nervous and guilty. I stayed late, talking with Emma about the strange documents. She pointed out something I hadn't noticed before. The notary stamp on Karen's papers belonged to someone whose license had expired 3 years ago. That wasn't all. When we looked closer at the other pages Karen had dropped during her dramatic exit, we found even more problems. Signatures didn't match, dates were inconsistent, and some street names were spelled differently on various pages. On my drive home that night, I spotted David and Karen in a heated argument in her driveway. David was waving papers in the air while she jabbed a finger into his chest. I slowed just enough for my dash cam to snap a clear photo. Back home, I started laying out all the evidence on my kitchen table: the official maps, photos of the original property stakes, snapshots of Karen's suspicious documents, and that final image of her arguing with David. I had a gut feeling this went deeper than just my boat. I just needed the proof. Luckily, I had a friend who worked at the title company, someone who owed me a favor. I sent them a message and kept digging. Around midnight, surrounded by a sea of papers and post-it notes, I fell asleep at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed at dawn. A text from an unknown number read, "Meet me tomorrow morning at the coffee shop. I know what Karen's really up to." When I glanced out my window, I saw David's kitchen light was on and his shadow moved back and forth as he paced. The morning brought more than coffee. I found a strange envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter. My hands trembled as I read the opening line. "I need to tell you something that's been eating me up inside." It was from David, my neighbor of 5 years. "Karen has dirt on all of us," the letter continued, "but what she's doing to you isn't right." He explained how Karen had caught him building a pool house without permits last summer. Instead of reporting him, she made him an offer he couldn't refuse. In exchange for silence, he would help her fabricate property documents. She would make his permit problem disappear, and he'd make her new common ground lines look legitimate. Just as I finished the letter, I spotted David walking his dog across the street. He wouldn't meet my eyes, but I noticed a thick folder with the HOA logo tucked under his arm. Curious, I decided to follow at a distance, staying behind the maple trees that lined our block. David didn't go to the dog park like usual. Instead, he headed straight to Karen's house, entering through the side gate. I crept up to the fence, phone in hand, and started recording through a gap in the boards. I could see them at the patio table, maps spread out in front of them. Karen pointed at different sections while David nodded and marked up the pages with a red pen. Suddenly, my view was blocked. I looked up to see Linda, Karen's teenage daughter, but instead of yelling or alerting anyone, she silently motioned for me to meet her around the corner. She looked nervous, glancing back toward the house. "My mom's been doing this for years," she whispered. "She has a whole filing cabinet full of altered documents in her home office. I helped her organize them last month." My pulse quickened. This was bigger than I thought. Linda explained how her mom had been slowly redrawing property lines in the neighborhood to create new common areas, giving the HOA and Karen more control. She'd even gone as far as creating fake email accounts to send out official-looking notices about reassessments. Just then I got a text from Emma, who'd been helping me with legal research. She'd made a shocking discovery at the county clerk's office. Some of Karen's doctored documents had actually been submitted, but the clerk flagged them for inconsistencies. Emma shared the clerk's contact information and suggested we set up a formal meeting. On my way back home, David's dog started barking frantically. Karen rushed out, and I quickly ducked behind Mrs. Patterson's giant hydrangea bush. Through the leaves, I saw Karen hand David another envelope. His hands shook as he stuffed it into his pocket. That evening, I found another note from David in my mailbox. This one included copies of emails between him and Karen, revealing how she had threatened several other neighbors too. But the real bombshell? A USB drive. On it were scans of the original neighborhood plans from 1995, before Karen started tampering. I was about to call Emma when I noticed something strange. A moving truck pulling into David's driveway. He was loading boxes in the dark. His wife carried out family photos, tears in her eyes. They weren't just moving. They were fleeing. I stood on the sidewalk watching, torn between anger at their cowardice and understanding their fear. Karen had built herself a house of cards, using secrets to hold everyone in check. But she had no idea I had Linda's confession, Emma's findings, and the USB now locked safely in my desk. As David's truck drove off, Karen stepped onto her porch. She watched them leave with a satisfied smile, then turned and saw me standing across the street. Her smile faltered. She didn't know the house of cards was already shaking. But I had to be smart. One wrong move and the files might vanish. I walked back inside, ignoring her overly sweet good evening behind me. I started making copies of everything: David's letters, Linda's text messages, and the contents of the USB. Tomorrow would change everything, but tonight I had to protect the evidence. Then came the sound that jolted me awake. Chains. Metal chains scraping against concrete. I looked at the clock. It was 5:03 a.m. Through my bedroom window I saw flashing yellow lights casting eerie shadows across my front lawn. They were taking my boat. I threw on my shoes and grabbed my phone, already recording, as I sprinted into the cold morning air. There she was, Karen, standing like a general in a pantsuit, directing a tow truck driver who looked very uncomfortable. Behind her stood Mark and Laura, two other HOA board members, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating in their matching HOA polos. "What do you think you're doing?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fury bubbling inside me. Karen's head snapped in my direction. For a brief moment, genuine surprise flashed in her eyes before she quickly masked it with that familiar smirk. "Enforcing HOA regulations," she said, waving a paper in my face. "This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. This isn't the end of the story. The truth always finds a way to surface. We warned you about this before, so now we're taking action." The tow truck driver hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls as he glanced nervously between us. I pulled out my property survey on my phone, the one I'd carefully saved after David's warning. "This is private property, and you know it," I said firmly. "You have no right to be here." The driver's expression changed when he heard that, but Karen Sarah quickly shoved a paper in his face. "We have documentation right here showing this is common area property," she declared. But I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she held up the paper. "Continue with the removal, please." That's when I noticed something odd. The HOA letterhead on her document looked different from the usual ones. The font was slightly off and the logo wasn't quite right. I zoomed in with my phone camera, making sure to get a clear shot of what I suspected was yet another forged document. The driver looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, if this is a property dispute, I can't take the boat. It's a liability issue." Karen's face turned red. She pulled out her phone and began threatening to call his supervisor. I stayed calm and dialed the police non-emergency line, putting the call on speaker. Karen's eyes widened as I clearly explained the situation. HOA members trespassing on private property and attempting the unauthorized removal of my boat. The dispatcher assured me officers were en route, but Karen wasn't backing down. She whispered something to Mark, who ran to his car and returned with more papers. They huddled together, frantically swapping documents like kids trading baseball cards, clearly not expecting me to be awake and ready to fight back. Then something unexpected happened. Laura, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly stepped forward. "Karen, maybe we should wait. If he has survey documents." Karen whirled around, shooting Laura a glare that could freeze lava. Laura shrank back, but I caught it all on video. The first visible crack in Karen's perfect facade. The tow truck driver had seen enough. "Look, I'm not getting mixed up in this. Call us back when it's sorted out legally." He began packing up his equipment, ignoring Karen's protests and threats. As red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street, I noticed David watching from his window. Our eyes met briefly before he quickly shut the curtains, but not before I saw the faint glow of his phone. He'd been recording too. The police arrived just as Karen and her crew were trying to leave. Officers took statements from everyone, and I showed them my property survey along with the video of the entire incident. One officer looked particularly intrigued by Karen's documents, taking photos and detailed notes. What Karen didn't know was that while she was arguing with the police, I was texting Emma. As a retired property lawyer, Emma had seen plenty of HOA power grabs, but even she was shocked when I sent her pictures of Karen's documents. As the sun rose over the neighborhood, Karen and her crew finally left, but not before she turned to me and said something that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you're dealing with." She was right about one thing: it wasn't over. Because while she was focused on towing my boat, she hadn't noticed the new security cameras I'd installed after David's warning. They captured every angle of her early morning raid, and those cameras had caught something else too. Something that could turn the entire case upside down. I couldn't sleep, so I kept digging. The next morning, Emma invited me over for coffee. When I showed her my old property maps, she nearly spilled her drink. The boundaries were completely different from what Karen had been showing everyone. Emma opened her laptop and logged into the county records website. We spent hours comparing documents, and what we found made my heart race. Every single property line change in our neighborhood over the past year had Karen's fingerprints on it. She'd been slowly shaving off pieces of people's lots, turning private land into HOA-controlled common areas. Then we hit the jackpot. Emma noticed something strange about the filing dates. Karen had tried to backdate her changes, but she made mistakes. Some documents were dated during weeks when the county office was closed. Even better, the clerk who supposedly signed them had retired 2 years before the date on the papers. My phone buzzed. It was a text from David's wife, Amy. She was crying, saying David hadn't slept in days out of guilt. She sent me photos from meetings where Karen pressured David into helping her create fake documents. She'd promised to ignore his illegal pool house, but now she was threatening to report it anyway. Things got even more interesting when Mrs. Emily from down the street stopped by. She'd overheard Karen on a phone call with someone from another HOA, instructing them on how to adjust property lines to create more common areas. Mrs. Emily had recorded the entire call on her phone because she thought it sounded shady. Emma and I headed to the county clerk's office to dig deeper. Mr. Daniel, the clerk, remembered Karen immediately. He said she'd caused a scene when he questioned her paperwork. He pulled up her file and showed us she'd tried to submit changes for nearly every property in the neighborhood. Some adjustments were small, just a few feet, but they all gave the HOA more control. Even better, the office had security footage. In one video, Karen could be seen arguing with staff. At one point, she dropped a folder and papers spilled everywhere. The camera caught glimpses of rubber stamps and seals that shouldn't have been in her possession. Back at home, I started receiving calls from residents in other neighborhoods. Word had spread. People wanted to share their own horror stories. Karen had apparently been consulting for other HOAs, teaching them how to manipulate land designations. One community even lost their entire playground after their HOA claimed the land using Karen's methods. My cameras later caught Karen and David sneaking into my yard at night, measuring and taking photos. They didn't know I had added even more cameras after the boat incident. This time, audio was crystal clear. I watched the footage as Karen yelled at David for leaving a paper trail, while he insisted they had to come clean. Emma helped me compile all the evidence. We built a thorough case. Decades of property records, forged signatures, impossible dates, fake notary stamps, security footage, and even David's confession. The next day, I spotted Karen at the county office again. This time, Mr. Daniel gave me a subtle wink as he began making copies of everything she tried to submit. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. The investigation was far from over, and more truths were bound to surface. David had been quietly helping us build our case, carefully documenting every false record Karen Sarah tried to sneak through. Just when we thought we had enough evidence to move forward, I got a call from my old friend Mike at the title company. What he found changed everything. Karen had pulled the same scheme in 3 other communities before moving here. She always left town just before people caught on. But this time, things were going to be different. That evening, I watched Karen strut around the neighborhood with her clipboard, jotting down her usual bogus violations. I felt strangely calm. Tomorrow's emergency board meeting would change everything. She had no idea that every piece of her puzzle was about to fall apart. Linda sat beside me that night, reviewing our presentation one last time. That's when we both froze. As we double-checked some files, we realized something terrifying. Karen wasn't just stealing land, she was selling parts of it too. The emergency HOA meeting started with a bang. I wheeled in a projector and several boxes of documents. Karen sat in her usual spot at the head of the table, wearing her fake pearls and an even faker smile. She was completely unprepared for what was coming. I began my presentation with a simple question to the packed room. How many of you have received violation notices about your property lines in the last 6 months? Almost every hand went up. Karen's smile twitched. I clicked to the first slide, a forged property map created by Karen side by side with the official county record. The room fell completely silent. Then Emma, our retired property lawyer, walked in wearing her courtroom blazer. She'd helped me prepare a detailed presentation, complete with records showing how Karen had been slowly shifting property lines in our neighborhood. Every slide showed another parcel Karen had falsely claimed as common area, including the spot where my boat had been parked. Then David stood up, visibly shaking. He confessed everything, how Karen had blackmailed him into helping create fake documents by threatening to expose his pool house violation. But he had saved every email, every draft, every message. He had a full archive of their scheme. Shock turned into outrage. Then I showed the financial records Emma helped uncover. Karen hadn't just been stealing land, she'd also been charging residents storage fees for vehicles parked on land she claimed was HOA property, pocketing thousands of dollars. The money trail led straight to a private account in her name. Just as Karen tried to defend herself with a rehearsed speech about community beautification, I played my final card. Security camera footage from my house and 3 other neighbors, showing the exact moment Karen directed the tow truck driver to take my boat. Her aggressive body language and the driver's visible discomfort said it all. But then came the real bombshell. Mrs. Emily, from the county clerk's office, stepped forward. She told the room how Karen had tried to pressure her into filing the forged property documents. When persuasion didn't work, Karen had tried to bribe her. Mrs. Emily had kept everything, notes, emails, even photos of the documents Karen submitted. That was when Karen lost control. She jumped up, screaming that we were ungrateful, that she was the only one who cared about property value. Her voice echoed through the room until it was cut short by the entrance of 2 police officers. They had been waiting outside after reviewing our evidence earlier that day. The vote to remove Karen was unanimous. As she was escorted out, still yelling about her vision for the community, I noticed David sitting down slowly, tears in his eyes. The weight of his guilt had finally lifted. We spent the next 3 hours electing a new board and beginning the process of restoring all the property records Karen had manipulated. Emma was voted in as our new HOA president. Her first promise: transparency and proper legal procedure, always. The next morning I got my boat back. The towing company apologized and refunded every cent after seeing the official documents. They even offered to testify if Karen took things to court. A week later, Karen's house went up for sale. While helping the real estate agent measure her lot correctly, we discovered something ironic. Karen's own backyard was smaller than she had claimed. She'd been living on her neighbor's property for years, thanks to her own fake maps. The story made the local news. It sparked a wave of inspections and reforms in nearby neighborhoods. 3 HOA presidents resigned within the week. Emma started getting calls from lawyers and homeowners dealing with similar fraud. Everyone wanted advice. Yesterday, I spotted Karen in a nearby gated community, touring homes. He was carrying a folder labeled Community Improvement Plans. I thought about warning them, but then I had a better idea. I called Emma. We decided to start a website dedicated to tracking HOA fraud cases, helping homeowners recognize red flags, gather documentation, and fight back with facts. This morning, I parked my boat in its rightful place and saw David outside installing new security cameras on his porch. He waved and smiled, a genuine smile. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. Our neighborhood was finally breathing again. But then, just as I was sipping my coffee, I received an email from someone living in that gated community Karen had visited. They wanted to know more about our experience. I glanced at the boxes of evidence stacked in my living room and smiled. Maybe it was time to pay it forward. Maybe it was time to help another community avoid what we had lived through. We had taken back our neighborhood, and we weren't stopping there.